Good evening, and thank you for joining us at Uptown Nauer Performing Arts Center for an in-depth look at the pandemic, the economy, and the future of live entertainment. I'm Chris Hanning, Dean of the Wells School of Music at Westchester University, and your moderator for tonight's show. Uptown is thrilled to be able to offer this live stream event as a way to continue connecting with you, our patrons, while upholding our mission to offer thought-provoking programming. Uptown is still a young venue, and yet continues to build engaging and entertaining content, even during this time of closure. We remain committed to presenting the music, comedy, and theater you have come to love, as well as adding some exciting new work to our roster. We thank you for joining us for this virtual event and look forward to seeing you in this wonderful venue in person when we reopen. Tonight, we'll be joined by Dr. Mark Zandi, Chief Economist for Moody's Analytics, and Hal Reel, founder and CEO of World Cafe Live and co-founder of the National Independent Venue Association. During this next hour, they will walk us through the economic toll the pandemic has placed on the performing arts industry, and you'll want to stay tuned until the end of the program when we dive deeper into how next week's election might affect the future of our industry. We'll start with specific economic questions with Mark, and then arts organization questions with Hal, and finally bring them back together for a Q&A session. We encourage you to submit your questions in our live chat during the show, and we will get to as many of them as time allows. So first, let me introduce Dr. Mark Zandi. Welcome, Mark. I believe, Mark, you might be on mute, possibly.
Indeed I am. I'm sorry about that.
Great.
I've done so many of these Zoom calls, I should know better by now. But, as I was saying, thank you, Chris. It's very nice of you to have me. I really appreciate the opportunity to participate. Uptown is a very important institution for the Westchester community, and I'm very happy that I can help out in a small way. So thanks for including me.
Absolutely. So I believe you have a PowerPoint presentation. You're going to talk about some points before we get started with some questions. Sure,
happy to. I thank you for the 3 hours to speak. That's very kind of you. No, only kidding. You know, nothing worse than an economist for more than, maybe I'll go on for about 15 minutes and walk through a few slides. My task is to give you a sense of where the economy is headed over the near term. Obviously, we're in the middle of a pandemic. Hard to think much beyond that, but I'll give you a sense of how I think things are going to unfold. Give you my best case scenarios, kind of in the middle of the distribution of possible outcomes, and then given the uncertainties here, and there are a lot of obviously moving parts, we'll talk about the risks. So let's just move to that first slide in the deck, and I think that nicely encapsulates where we've been and where I think we're headed through the next president's first term. This is jobs, employment, millions of jobs. This is monthly data from January of 2019 through the end of 2024. You can see the recession was very short. Actually, it was just 2 months, March, April. That's the shortest recession in our economic history. The typical recession, at least since World War II, has been about 9 months, so a very short recession, but very severe. You can see we lost 22 million jobs in those 2 months. We've not seen anything like that. We did experience a bounce when businesses started to reopen back beginning in late April, extending into May, June, July. Recovered about half the 22 million jobs we lost. So we're still down about 11 million jobs. So kind of the metaphor I use to kind of describe all this is the economy fell into this deep, dark hole back in March and April. We're digging our way out, but we're only about halfway out. You can see where I think we're headed between now and the end of the pandemic, which I'm pegging to be sometime mid next year. That's when I expect that there will be a vaccine or vaccines that are reasonably effective and widely distributed enough that people feel comfortable again about going out in a more fulsome way. Maybe Uptown will be open by then, and people can come and enjoy the entertainment at the theater. But between now and then, the economy will grow, but it'll be very slow growth. There are a lot of cross currents here. The headwind of the pandemic, that's intensifying, and obviously that's going to be a weight on the economy. But we have the tailwinds of monetary and fiscal policy, low interest rates in particular, and that should help. But really, it'll be a bit of a slog. It's going to be a difficult time between now and mid next year when I think we get some relief. On the other side of the pandemic, I mean, if we have this conversation a year from now, hopefully we're in a better place. People are getting the vaccine. People are less nervous about getting sick. We should kick into a higher gear. There's just a lot of pent up demand. I mean, people haven't been going to Uptown. They desperately want to get there. And, once they have the opportunity, I'm sure they'll be filling those seats behind you, Chris, and going to ball games and going to restaurants and doing all the things, taking advantage of all the things that downtown Westchester is able to provide, and we'll kick into a higher gear. So, but even after all of that, you can see by the chart that it's really not until kind of late 2023, that's 3 years from now, before we recover all those jobs. And it really won't be until then that I think we feel like we've made our way back and feel comfortable about things. So this is not a V-shaped recovery. This isn't we're getting back what we lost quickly. This is a slog. This is a process. It's going to take time. Okay, that's kind of the baseline. That's kind of in the middle again of the distribution of possible outcomes. Let's talk about the risks, and let me quickly identify several risks that we need to account for. Risk number one is the pandemic. So if you move to the next slide, this is only an economist could love this chart. It's not that complicated though, so let me explain it. The horizontal axis, the so-called x-axis, that's just the number of infections per million inhabitants for every state across the country. The dots in the scatter plot here are just represent different states. The vertical axis, the y-axis, that represents the change in the unemployment rate in those states between August, 3 months ending in August, compared to the fourth quarter of 2019. The fourth quarter of 2019 was pre-pandemic. The economy was pretty close to full employment. And that line you see, that is simply a regression line, a simple line that PowerPoint puts in that tries to fit the points there as close as possible. And you can see it's moving upwards, it's upward sloping. And that suggests that as you get more infections, that ultimately you get fewer jobs and higher unemployment. So the risk here, obviously, as the pandemic is intensifying, we've gone from, say, 40,000 infections per day on average 4, 6, 8 weeks ago to closer to 75, 80,000 per day. That's a significant threat to the economy. Not that I think that we're going to shut businesses down. I don't think there's any going back on that. But that doesn't matter. I think consumers, you and I, business people are going to be nervous about what all this means and will become much more cautious in their spending. Certainly won't go out and travel and do all the things that they would normally typically do, go back into that bunker. And so obviously that's a real threat. In my baseline outlook that I presented in the beginning, I've been assuming that the pandemic, we may see more infections, but it wouldn't get to a place where it would be disruptive to businesses. That's obviously a very tenuous assumption given what we're observing across the country. Really hasn't affected us here yet to a significant degree in southeastern Pennsylvania, although I did notice in Westchester, because of I'm sure the university, we're seeing more infections. But in the rest of much of the rest of the country, this is becoming more of an issue. Second threat, and you can move to the second risk and move to the next slide, is the lack of fiscal support, the lack of the inability of the Trump administration and Congress to get together and pass additional support for the economy. As you know, the administration and Congress did get together early on in the pandemic, passed the CARES Act. That was a very large package of support to the economy, unemployment insurance, money to small businesses, help to airlines, more money for the healthcare system. I can go on, but $3.5 trillion worth of support. But that money's gone. We've blown through it. And I think at this point, we need more help from the federal government, and we're not getting it. And just to give you a sense of what that means, we have these models of the economy. We've run through these models, different scenarios with regard to different packages of fiscal support. And this shows you the impact on the unemployment rate. The green line is the unemployment rate if we don't get any additional fiscal support. And you can see that's not a pretty picture. We're not going to go back to the unemployment that we experienced early on in the pandemic, but in the next few months, if we don't get additional support, we'll start to see some job loss again, and unemployment will begin to rise. And it really isn't until the end of 2024 that we get back to anything we would consider to be full employment that we feel comfortable with. That's a dark path to go on. The orange line represents a package that's equal to $1.5 trillion worth of support. That's kind of sort of where I thought Congress and the administration were going to land prior to the election. Obviously, that seemed to make economic sense. To me, it seemed to make political sense that they would come to terms and agree to that package. And if they did, you can see what the world would have looked like. Certainly better than a world with no additional fiscal support. And this, to round things out, the blue line represents what would happen to unemployment if we got the HEROES Act. That's the piece of legislation that the Democratic House passed a few months ago, worth $3.5 trillion, a very large package of support. And you can see we get a much stronger economy, more jobs, unemployment would fall more quickly, and we get back to full employment by the middle of 2022. In most times when the economy is at full employment, inflation is up, and interest rates are high, that kind of fiscal package probably wouldn't work all that well because it would just result in higher interest rates, which would offset the benefits of the fiscal support. But we're in a different time now. We have very high unemployment, close to 8% nationwide, higher in Pennsylvania. We have very low inflation, below 2%. That's the Federal Reserve's target. And most importantly, we have zero interest rates. Interest rates are at zero. And the Federal Reserve has said point blank that they're not going to be raising interest rates until we're back to full employment. So with that kind of economic backdrop, that would make a good sense to really provide a lot of additional support, deficit financed, to get the economy going, to get to the other side of the pandemic and get the economy going back to full. Unfortunately, at this point, we're not going to get that package of support, at least not until the next president's inaugurated early next year. And that's obviously a risk to my baseline outlook, my baseline optimism. The third risk is the election itself. And here, if you move to the next slide, we have our own expectation for how this election is going to play out. We have a model of the state electoral college where we explain the share of the vote that goes to the incumbent party, in this case, the Republican Party. And we explain that with various political variables, everything from previous voting patterns by state to the president's approval rating and many other political variables, along with a range of economic variables, unemployment, obviously, incomes, house prices, gasoline prices, and stock prices, which have taken on added importance in recent years for various reasons. And based on current conditions in the economy and the president's current approval rating, this is the outcome. Very close election. Biden will win 279 electoral votes to 259. As you know, you need 270 to win. I will point out that Pennsylvania is the single most important state in this election. It's the key swing state, at least according to our modeling and everything else that you can hear from the polling that's going on. Southeast Pennsylvania, Chester County, also critically important. I'll go so far as to say my street, Laurel Circle, out here in Malvern, PA, may be in fact the most important street for this election. And actually it may even boil down. I haven't proved this statistically yet, Chris, but I'm working on it. This whole thing may all boil down to my wife and how she votes. So all eyes on my wife. That's how critical it is. But the risk here is if it is a close election, and I should say the polling would suggest that Biden should win handily and the Congress should turn Democratic. But as we all know, polls are polls, and it didn't work out so well in 2016 for the Democrats. So I think a prudent planner would count on a very close election. If that's the case, then the risk here is that this becomes a contested race, goes into the court system, takes a long time to iron out, and you can construct some pretty dark scenarios, all of which are not good for the economy. It just creates uncertainty in an uncertain environment. Business people are pretty reluctant to go out and hire and invest. So this is a third risk to my baseline outlook for the economy. Finally, I'll just end very quickly. The fourth risk is the election itself and the outcome. There's this, and you can move to the next slide. There is this old saw that this election is the most important election in our lifetimes, but I don't think we're exaggerating here. This is the single most important election in our lifetime in terms of the direction for economic policy and policy in general. And you get a clear sense of that here. This is my assessment of the key policy issues, where the different candidates land, rank ordered from where they're most different, where they're least different in terms of their policy positions. And you can see on governing, these guys are night and day on how they would handle COVID-19, the pandemic, immigration policy, climate change, energy, healthcare, taxes, gun control, all very different perspectives on this. There are policies where they're closer in agreement. They're both very skeptical. Big tech, the Department of Justice has filed suit against Google. That may very well have happened under a Biden administration. They're both willing to use deficits and debt to implement their fiscal policies. They're both willing to confront China because China is not playing fair. They'll do it very differently. I don't think Biden would pursue a tariff war, probably engage in a multilateral approach to addressing China, but they're both very skeptical of China and would continue to confront China. But at the end of the day, how this election plays out is going to have big implications for economic policy and how the economy plays out in coming years. And I will say in my baseline that I started with, that graph I showed of employment, I am assuming Biden wins with a split Congress. So stay tuned, buckle in. There's a lot of script to be written here. I'd be surprised if my forecast actually came to pass. There's just so many moving parts, but that's the tough part being an economist. It's hard to be right. I will end this way, Chris. I aspire to be 51% right. That is my goal.
Very good. Well,
but then I'll turn it back to you.
Yeah, I will say this, that with your wife being the most important voter in all this, I hope, because she's in Pennsylvania, she's already mailed in her ballot and has received confirmation that it's been received, right?
Well, no, we made a decision. She made a decision. We all made a decision. We got the mail-in ballots, but we're not going to mail them. We're actually going to vote in person because PA's got a wacko system where they don't start counting the mail-in ballots until Election Day. And we want to make sure our votes are counted on Election Day. So we're going to wait. So you got to take the mail-in ballot. Don't do anything with it. Hand it to the folks at the polling place. They take it, they shred it, and then you go in and vote. So we're going to go do that.
Well, thank you so much for all that outlook, and I'm happy that your wife's going to go to the polling booth, and because that's going to be extremely important for all of us. I do have a question from one of our listeners who stated that your job baseline chart is very interesting, and wondered if we know what it looked like in 1918.
Oh, interesting question. Amazingly, how we've responded to the pandemic, this pandemic, COVID-19, has been very similar to the way we responded to the Spanish flu back in the early 1900s. And the economic impacts were very, very similar. We have scanty data. It's not nearly as good as we have now. I mean, we didn't have the quality or the breadth of the information, but we do have data on manufacturing employment. And if you look at manufacturing employment, because manufacturing was a much larger part of the economy back in that period, and it was easier to count, you do see a very similar pattern. And you also see, if you look across, we had state data, if you look across states, those states that had more severe infections from the Spanish flu, their manufacturing employment declined more. So remember that scatter plot I showed you? If you went back to that period and did it for manufacturing employment vis-a-vis Spanish flu infections, it looks very eerily similar, eerily similar. So, the weird thing is, it's almost like we didn't learn very much. I mean, clearly they couldn't develop a vaccine like we can develop now, but we are doing exactly the same thing that we did back then, to almost to the T. I mean, back then hopefully the major difference is that virus mutated and became much more virulent in the second wave that hit about this time in I think it was 1918. And killed a lot of people. So hopefully that, I don't think that's happened in this go around. This virus hasn't mutated, but that's one key difference between now and then. But you can see pictures of in Boston of schools that holding classes outside. So they even came to the conclusion, rightfully so, I mean, based on what we know now, that you need to be outside. You should be outside so that you don't transmit the virus. So they had the same kind of issues and they responded in almost precisely the same way. It's really amazing.
That is interesting. At Westchester University, we have a lot of our classes that are in person happening outside. And in music, we actually have our choirs singing in the parking garage with masks on. So we're finding creative ways to make that happen. I have another question from the listening audience, and this is actually very similar to a question that one of our board members came up with as well. Does the amount of deficit created by the government support concern for you? And is it okay to manufacture money?
Yeah, debt and deficits are a concern, but I'd say a couple things. One is I don't think we have any choice but to borrow money heavily now to help support the various fiscal rescue packages that are necessary to get the economy to the other side of the pandemic. Because if we don't provide that support, I think the economy will suffer significantly. We'll go back into recession, and the damage to our fiscal situation will be even worse. So it's a Hobson's choice, as they say. There's no good choice. It's a Sophie's choice. We're picking the least bad choice. So that's the first thing I'd say. It's not. This pandemic is going to be very costly in the end, but we have no choice but to pay the price. The second thing I'd say, though, is once the economy is back to full employment, once we use our resources, both the monetary and fiscal policy, we get back to something we feel comfortable with, then I think we will need to pivot and address our fiscal problems. And that'll mean spending restraint, because we're spending a lot of money now to help people and help businesses. We're going to have to show spending restraint, and we're going to have to raise taxes. I think we're going to have to do both, and get our fiscal house in a much better place for the next crisis that's going to hit, because invariably one will hit. I mean, given our luck here, if you think about it, we had 9/11 20 years ago, then we had the financial crisis 10 years ago, and now we've been hit by the pandemic. These are three massive body blows that have been, it's actually testimonial to the strength of our economy that we could navigate through these three things and still be where we are today. These are really tremendous, significant hits to our economy. But I think we need to prepare for the next one, and we're going to have to pivot. And I think we're going to be forced to be frank, Chris. I think global investors who are buying this debt are going to say, hey, because we're not the only one on the planet that's doing this. Every country in the world is doing the same thing. And so investors are going to say, look, there's a lot of debt out there. I'm not so sure you're going to pay me back, or at least pay me back in a timely way. They're going to demand a higher interest rate to compensate for that risk. And, that gets to our interest expense and to our deficits and debt. And so that's going to be put a lot of pressure on governments and fiscal policymakers to address this. And by the way, I'll say this one last thing. That's almost necessary to happen, because I don't think lawmakers, policymakers, politicians can generate the political will unless they can connect the dots between the deficits and debt and the economy. And the only way they can do that is if interest rates are rising and going higher. They can say, hey, look, if we don't do this, we're going to be spending a large share of our budget on just paying investors. We can't spend it on infrastructure. We can't spend it on Social Security. We can't do the things we need to do as a government. So we need to get our fiscal house in order. And I think that's what we're going to do. In terms of printing money, the limit there is really inflation. The concern is you print so much money, it creates a lot of demand that outstrips supply. Businesses raise prices very quickly. Inflation begins to accelerate, and that becomes its own set of problems. But that's not a problem at this point. Inflation has been very low, too low, uncomfortably low. And the Federal Reserve at this point is working really hard to raise inflation. So that's less of an issue. It may become more of an issue down the road as the economy gets back to full employment. But at this point, that is not a significant concern. It's not a constraint on our ability to keep interest rates low and to provide a lot of support to the economy.
And as we transfer over to Hal, I think a good question for you to help segue us is, Hal has started the National Independent Venue Association, is one of the founders of that association. We're talking about probably a lot of small businesses, small theaters, small operations. Yeah. How has this pandemic affected small businesses specifically, and what do you see as the long-term impacts on small business? And then I'm going to bring Hal in to talk about what he's seeing from his constituents.
Yeah, good point. I mean, I said this is not a V-shaped recovery, so that begs the question of, well, what shape is it? And the most apt description is a K-shaped recovery, which if you think about it, we went way down, we came up halfway, and now we have very divergent kind of paths here. So some groups in our society, some businesses, industries have been creamed by the pandemic, where others are navigating through very gracefully. So low income, lesser skilled workers, minority groups, they've been crushed. Higher income folks like you and I, who can work from home, have good health care, we have a home, we own some stock, we're in very good shape, no problem. The retail sector, leisure hospitality, entertainment, transportation, healthcare, they've been crushed. Tech industry, my financial services business, professional services, no problem. Big companies are doing very, very well. They've navigated through. They've had the resources to do all the things they need to do to mitigate the fallout of the virus on their employees, and they've been able to raise money, and they're benefiting from the rising stock market. Smaller companies are struggling. They're having a great deal of difficulty. They didn't have the resources coming into this. They've had to rely on PPP money. That's the support they've been getting from the government, from the CARES Act. So small businesses have really been hurt very, very significantly. And that's why, because we have these divergent trends, we really do need government, the federal government, to step back up and let everyone know, primarily smaller businesses, minority groups, lower income households, that the government, that when I say government, that's you and I collectively, have their back, because that's the only way we're going to get this economy back on track, get back into full gear, and feel comfortable about where we are. So small businesses have really taken it on the chin here, and they they need and deserve our help.
Well, thank you, Mark. And with that, I'll transition to Hal and bring Hal Reel on and talk about this with his organization and how the pandemic is affecting these independent venues. And I applaud you, Mark, for talking about funding for small businesses and the support from the government, because for those of us in the arts, we're always screaming more funding for the arts. And this is a time that we are desperate for that kind of funding. So I'll bring on Hal, and Hal, welcome. He's got a video that he's going to present to us that talks about the National Independent Venue Association. And welcome, Hal.
Thank you so much, Mark, and Mark and Chris. Thank you both, and thank you to the Uptown. World Cafe Live has been very proud to present a number of shows at the Uptown. It's a great place, and we look forward to returning there when we can all do so safely. And I do want to roll into the video just a little bit of an intro. NIVA, the National Independent Venue Association, did not exist in March. We started in April in response to the pandemic. Today, we have almost 3,000 members in all 50 states and the District of Columbia. Our members are independent performing arts venues, primarily music venues, comedy clubs, and theaters that do a mixture of theatrical performances and other events. We are mom and pop businesses. So we're going to go from Mark's discussion of kind of the macro picture, and then he came down and talked about small businesses, to a particular segment of small businesses. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce recently said that 90% of American businesses are open in whole or in part. And the segment we're talking about basically is not open at all. We were the first to close, and we'll talk about some of the reasons we'll be the last to open. But a picture is worth 1,000 words. So if I can share this video that was made through NIVA's partnership with Google and YouTube, we did a share. Save Our Stages is our hashtag movement it's become. And there's a Save Our Stages Act pending in Congress. Last weekend, we had a festival, thanks to Google and YouTube's support. And this was one of the public service announcements during that virtual festival that aired for 3 days. So if we could roll the video, thanks very much.
Shakespeare said, "All the world's a stage." But not every stage can raise you up high off the ground or bring you down all the way to your knees or take you in like you've always belonged. All the world's a stage, but not every stage is part of our history, part of our culture, part of our community. All the world's a stage, but there are some stages that feel like the whole world.
So as you can see, independent venues have a storied history and a very special role in the American entertainment ecosystem. And these venues now have zero revenue. Obligations like mortgage, rent, bills, loans, taxes, and insurance continue. We have no work to offer our employees for the foreseeable future. For us, the shutdown is indefinite, likely to extend well into 2021, as all of our polls of our audiences show that until there's a vaccine or an inexpensive, reliable, rapid test, nobody's going to be comfortable coming back to our venues, which are places for people to come together. That's what we're all about. And the ability to open at partial capacity is not economically feasible. Our costs are not on a sliding scale. Our costs match the capacity we're permitted to host, and they're fixed costs. Many of our members frankly run at such slim margins, it's tough to make it at 100%. And in addition, we rely on a national routing of tours. So until the entire country is open at 100% capacity, we're not going to be able to open our doors and resume normal operations. We have a very substantial economic impact. Polestar estimated just ticket sales alone that have been lost through 2020 since March are $9 billion. 75% of all artist income comes from live events. And that $9 billion I mentioned didn't count food or beverage revenues at the venues, nor does it count the $12 in economic activity that's generated in the community for every dollar that's spent at a small venue. So people going out to dinner, the tourism industry, we put heads in beds at hotels, we fill the bars, we fill the restaurants before our shows. So the estimated direct annual economic impact that we bring to local communities is well into billions and billions of dollars. And meanwhile, our members, 90% of our members say they will permanently close in a few months if there isn't some significant additional federal relief. As those of us who were able to take advantage of PPP have run out of that PPP. And really, whether you're a for-profit or a nonprofit or a government-owned theater, there's no place else to turn right now. And it's a very much realistically existential threat to this entire ecosystem. And I'm just talking about the economic impact. I have to mention the spiritual and the cultural impact that these venues have. Storied venues like the Apollo Theater and the Troubadour in LA. And if you love Adele, the first place she played in the United States was upstairs in the small stage we have at World Cafe Live. This is where our musicians and our actors and actresses cut their teeth. I've been on the board at People's Light and Theater for many, many years, and many people in Chester County know what a hub that is and what a place it is for the community to convene. And all of these venues are very much at risk.
And thank you for that. And you paint a bleak picture, but it does feel bleak to all my musician friends in Philadelphia and around the region who are out of work, waiting for the theaters to open. And I was very thankful that you mentioned the social impact, because even for musicians and actors and artists, not having that constant interaction with their peers has been devastating to that community, because we oftentimes, that's how we keep our friendships up, by seeing each other in the orchestra pits and on stage and in those types of venues. So can you tell me how these groups in your organization, or some of the ways that they're surviving right now? How are they getting by? Is it strictly on campaigns for donation? You mentioned the PPP and things like that from the CARES Act, but how are they managing?
It's a varied sector, and I think that there has been some relief for nonprofit organizations at the city level, at the state level, and a little bit at the federal level. For-profits, not so much, but in some states, not in Pennsylvania, but we've seen some significant recognition of this sector, and some of the CARES Act money allocated to the states, New Hampshire, Washington, Oregon, Wisconsin, a number of states have offered grants to help venues stay alive. Yes, venues have emergency relief funds for staff that's been furloughed. They have emergency relief funds for their own operations. And if they're available to access certain grant opportunities, they've done so. But for the most part, they've cut costs to the bone. I know at World Cafe Live on March 13th was our last show. There's been no revenue to speak of since then. In addition, we have obligations for ticket refunds and event deposit refunds. So we furloughed, out of our staff of over 90, we furloughed 80 people. And that's true at large performing arts centers like the Kimmel Center in Philadelphia, to smaller places like the Uptown. And so everybody has hibernated as much as possible, but there are, as I mentioned, fixed costs that continue even though you're not open for business. So, and some of the for-profits, especially who are our members at NEVA, people have borrowed, people have, if they owned their real estate, they've sold their real estate hoping to buy it back on the other side of the pandemic. Uh, there's a silver lining here. We never had a collective voice. Misery loves company, and we are all determined to come out the other side of this. And we know that after the Spanish flu came the roaring 20s. I think if you look at what Mark had to say, we may be talking the roaring mid or late 20s, but we all want to get to the other side to see that. And we want to welcome people back when it's safe to do so.
Well, I was going to ask you about a silver lining, but I also wondered about this pandemic environment we're living in, that many arts organizations are finding very creative ways to work around it, like we're doing right now with a live stream event. Are there any commercial opportunities you think might come out of this pandemic? I mean, we're all saying in the arts that, we're not going to go back to business as usual necessarily, that we're going to find some creative ways to enhance the live shows that we do. And I just wondered if you're hearing discussions with your venue colleagues about that.
Yeah, and I've seen incredibly creative efforts. So you have your drive-in shows, as People's Light and other places have done this summer. And theaters have certainly done outdoor performances with people socially distanced. And I think that those are all great. You see lots of virtual concerts from performers' barns or their living room or their at-home studio, or even from stages with no audience. Our entire festival was done from iconic stages across the country with no audience there. But although I think there is a long-term silver lining in that virtual will allow us to expand our reach and expand our audiences, and there will be some residual benefit to that down the road. In the short term, these are grains of sand for a segment of the arts industry that needs a beach. And frankly, when it comes to live music, and I apologize for being so cynical, but virtual is better than nothing. But to me, it's like seeing pictures of food. It's not the same as being in a room with people side by side and really enjoying that, feeling that bass pound in your chest and that thrill of that moment that will never be repeated again. You're there for that moment, and it's a unique moment for the performers and for the fans.
I was going to say, and for the performers as well, getting that feedback from an audience is always critical, and it's part of what we enjoy so much. I do have a question from our listening audience. Have you seen new models for performance that may survive the pandemic?
That's a really great question. I think there is something about the intimacy of seeing artists perform from their homes and barns and home studios that may allow us to, have some less conventional performances in the future. And maybe there'll be some more personal formats where people are more willing to share their vulnerabilities and not just be an act on stage. That's a possibility. I think there have been some very innovative things done in the theater world and the opera world. So we might see some things come out of this yet.
And I would also wonder about philanthropy, and many of our organizations survive on philanthropy, and what this economy might be doing to those potential donations that are keeping many of our venues alive, many of our performing organizations alive. Your thoughts on that?
Well, I'll also tell you that I chair the Mid-Atlantic Arts Foundation, I'm the board chair, which is one of the 6 regional arts organizations under the NEA. And the CARES Act included money from the NEA. It was about $75 million, some of which was distributed by the regional arts organizations. So Mid-Atlantic Arts Foundation distributed about $800,000 to applicants applying for $10 million. So while, yes, there certainly have been philanthropic gestures, the need is so deep and so great in these organizations that it's a bit of a drop in the bucket. And There are foundations, I will tell you. World Cafe Live became a nonprofit effective December 1st, combining with an educational nonprofit, Live Connections, that we had previously established. We now are one unified nonprofit under the World Cafe Live name. And some of the foundations that supported our educational efforts over the years, without us even asking, sent us additional funds in the early days. It was amazing. They said, "We know you didn't apply, but we love your work. We know you need this. Keep your chin up, and keep going." But of course, as well intentioned as that was back in March and April and May, that's faded a bit because there's so much need again, and everybody's got to really take a step back and figure out what they're going to do. But we've seen it's been so reaffirming. The donations to our emergency relief fund from individuals for our employees while they were waiting for unemployment to kick in was amazing. We raised $75,000 in a few weeks from people we'd never asked to give before. And this was for the people who took their tickets and the people who poured their beer and the people who mixed their sound. And that's terrific. So I think people have really stood up. I think we're all being asked to give more, and I think people are giving more and have been very generous. But we do need, as Mark said, some serious fiscal relief at the federal and state level.
Well, speaking of Mark, I'd love to take this moment now to bring Mark back on and have the two of you have a discussion with me. And I'm hoping that our audience is going to put some more questions in there for us. I do have a question that maybe you can both address here while we wait on our audience to plug some questions in. Chief of Staff Mark Meadows recently stated that their administration will not be able to contain the virus until there is a vaccine. VP Biden has stated that he will use the National Defense Act to increase testing and supply more PPE and push states to enforce mask mandates. How might these different policy positions affect our chances to reopen as a theater here and your theater and organizations like that across the country? So why don't we start with Mark, and you can jump in on that, and then we'll have some.
Well, I mean, I think the strategy of letting the virus run its course without any response takes us down potentially some pretty dark paths, and almost ensures that we're not going to reopen Uptown anytime soon. People are just going to be too nervous to go, even if you could. I mean, even if there was no constraints legally from the state or from Westchester or from any other local official, I just don't see people going to the theater. They're just not going to get in the room with other people in that kind of context. So that seems like a pretty losing strategy. At this point, I think the approach that Vice President Biden has proposed to take is probably the most, it's going to be difficult because the virus is now out of control. It's going to be difficult to contain it under any policy proposal or solution. But his approach of really encouraging mask wearing, because we know that works. That's what the healthcare professionals are telling us, that all of the evidence suggests that's true. And provide an example of mask wearing and social distancing. And, maybe selectively requiring businesses where people gather together to, be more judicious in how that happens, will land us in a better place in the long run. But let me say, bottom line, I don't think our economy is going to get back on track until this virus is resolved, one way or the other. I just, I think it's irrelevant whether we close businesses or not. We're not getting back to normal until we've contained the virus. Just to give you a counterfactual that we could have been is Asia. Just go take a look at Asia. I mean, take a look at Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, South Korea, Taiwan, Japan, China. These countries, they locked down very aggressively early on, and they were 2 months ahead of us. They locked down, they contained the virus, they invested very aggressively in testing and tracing, and now they're off and running. I mean, there's no cases of significance. their economies are back. They experienced a V-shaped recovery. They're back. That could have been us, and it isn't. So, but that is they're showing us the path, and the path is we should do the things that the professionals, healthcare professionals and scientists have been telling us. Simple stuff, and I think we'd go down a better path. But giving up, I mean, that's not going to get people to go to theaters. That's just we're just waiting for that miracle, that vaccine.
Absolutely. Hal, any thoughts about that?
I absolutely agree with what Mark said. Our audiences are not going to return. Our artists are not going to return until everybody has this feeling that it's safe to do so. That's the short of it.
And Hal, let me ask you another question that just came in from the audience. What can we do to get Save Our Stages passed?
Well, Mark spoke to this. Honestly, I think the biggest political issue that we have right now is uncertainty. And so Save Our Stages has bipartisan support in both the Senate and the House. Music and theater touch everybody. It's not a Republican and Democratic issue. It's in every small town, village, and city. It's rural as well as in the urban centers. And we really don't see opposition. But they couldn't get over their politics. And I'm saying they, as in both the Democrats and the Republicans, to get to this package. So we were thrilled that when the HEROES Act passed the House, it included the airline bill, it included the Restaurant Act, and it included Save Our Stages. And even in Mnuchin's response, it included Save Our Stages. We've broadened that so it includes Broadway theaters, it includes it includes independent movie theaters, it's become a broadened sector because many of these venues are in the same boat. And I think it will get there, but the politics have to be resolved. And now, we expected it to happen in July or August. And the real risk right now is that literally venues are closing every day. In Pennsylvania alone, Philadelphia lost Warm Daddy's, been around for 25 years. We lost the Fox Theater in Pittsburgh last week, the Chameleon Club in Lancaster. And this is going on all across the country. Every day we have members who say, we just can't make it any further. And that the risk is the time. So if in fact it's contested and the politicians can't pass a relief package until well into January, this is going to brutally change the landscape. And the nightlife of this country is going to suffer for years because these venues are going to be gone.
And Mark, in your experience of watching legislation passed for funding support and those sorts of things, what is the likelihood that we'll get support for the arts from the legislation? I mean, it's always been something that from an arts perspective, we felt underfunded and undersupported by the government when other governments are supporting their theaters and musicians. What are your thoughts about that, Mark?
Well, it depends on the election and the outcome. I think that if you have a Democratic sweep, Biden presidency, House, Senate go Republican, to go Democratic, you'll get a much larger. The nation will get a much larger fiscal rescue package on Biden's inauguration in February. And in a very large, when I say large package, they were Nancy Pelosi and Secretary of Treasury Mnuchin were coalescing around $2 trillion. My sense is it would be, it'd be at least that, probably closer to 3, closer to the CARES Act. And if that's the size of the package, then I think there's a reasonable shot that there would be funding for the arts, that they would be considered to be, in the same boat as the airline industry. We need the arts. We need to support the arts. It's vital to our well-functioning society. and we should provide that additional funding. I think if it's a different election outcome, then the size of the package that we get, and I think under any scenario, whether it's the status quo, Trump is reelected with a split Congress, even if it was a Republican sweep, there will be another package, I think, on the other side of the inauguration, because the economy is going to be struggling and the pandemic is going to be raging, and the political pressure to do something will be very intense. So we'll get something, but it'll be a much smaller package. It'll be for example, the House Republicans put forward a package that was equal to about $500 billion. If that's the case, then no, I don't. You've got a set of priorities, and the arts are not going to get above the line. They're going to be well below the line, and so I have a hard time seeing any money coming to the entertainment industry, the arts, in that scenario. So remember back what I said about this election has consequence. This one has almost immediate consequence.
And Hal, you
Chris,
want to jump in there? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to say I'm sorry. I think I acted a little bit like a politician and didn't really answer the question from your viewer. So the most direct answer about how you can help is go to saveourstages.com, and you will there find ways that you can go right to your legislators and ask them to get the SOS Act passed. And in Pennsylvania, Representative Jake Wheatley from Pittsburgh just introduced the SOS Act in Pennsylvania. And there is now a petition that just went live today and already has 5,000 signatures at changes.org/SavePAVenues. Changes.org/SavePAVenues. And tell the state legislators that these venues need help from the CARES Act money that's already been allocated in Pennsylvania. There's $1 billion sitting there. It's not yet been spent.
Well, we'll see if we can get some of these web locations up on Uptown's website for people to come to our website and get that information. We'll make sure we provide that to you. We have another question from our audience. During an economic crisis, there's increased need for charitable contributions across the board. Is there any historical data on changes in arts donations compared to basic needs like food pantries, homeless services, children's charities, etc.?
I don't have a statistical answer to that, but I can tell you that absolutely is the dilemma, of course. And humanitarian aid usually comes first, but when you think about the healing power of the arts, it's not far behind.
Absolutely, yeah. Mark, do you have anything to add to that question?
No, I don't know.
Pretty,
Sorry, Chris.
yeah.
It's not something I've looked into. So I have my intuition, but it's probably not right. So.
There are also, there's another question I have here from the audience. The arts are also supported by state and local grants. And you've kind of answered this a little bit, but do you want to expand on this at all? How do you see those funds holding up during these times?
Yeah, I think that is true. And some people think of the arts as meaning really nonprofit arts and culture. And one of the silver linings, again, of this pandemic is that we've blurred the lines between nonprofit and for-profit. We all sell tickets, we all host shows and events, we all are community hubs. And so very little of those state and local grants go to that nonprofit sector, and yet the for-profit sector. And yet that for-profit sector has a very significant economic as well as cultural and spiritual impact on their communities.
Well, we have another question here that about the role for SOS after advocacy for funding. Is there a future role in this? And I know for me, I'm hoping that a result of this pandemic and the way the arts have suffered during this pandemic, that there would be an outcry for support. And I wonder if you see that as a possibility. My biggest fear is we're going to come through this whole thing and it's going to be back to business as usual. The arts are the first thing that gets cut, and that's how things roll in our country typically. And I wonder what your thoughts are. I mean, I'm also an optimist, so I'd like to think that there would be a change moving forward. But I wonder about your thoughts on that.
Well, as I said, NEVA was 10 years in the making. It just never really happened until this crisis. And now we are all very excited about the opportunities beyond this. The industry has lots of opportunity to diversify, to raise our voice, to do things collectively that we could never do without having this voice. So absolutely, there's a life for NEVA and for this independent venue collective beyond the pandemic. We look
Well,
forward to that.
I do too. And we are at the witching hour here, so to speak. And we'd like to thank Mark Zandi and Hal Reel for sharing their insight and expertise with us this evening. We'd also like to thank Valley Creek Productions for their videography services. A special acknowledgement goes to Uptown Board President Holly Brown for her efforts in bringing tonight's event together. Most importantly, we thank you, the viewers, for supporting Uptown with your ticket purchase. As we remain closed during these uncertain times, your patronage is more valued than ever. If you enjoyed tonight's live stream, we ask that you consider purchasing a membership or making a donation, speaking of philanthropy. By doing so, you are securing Uptown's future and our ability to continue offering both virtual and live performances. Whether this was your first experience with Uptown or you are a returning fan, we hope you enjoyed the presentation, and we look forward to seeing you again. Again, thank you, Mike. Thank you, Hal. Have a terrific evening. Thanks for being here and having this wonderful conversation. I really appreciate it.